Flight 2093 from Denver to San Francisco was cruising smoothly at 39,000 feet when the right engine exploded. The sound was deafening, a massive bang that shook the entire aircraft and sent shrapnel tearing through the wing. Passengers screamed as the plane lurched violently to the right. Oxygen masks dropped from overhead compartments. Luggage flew from overhead bins. Coffee and drinks splattered across passengers. In an instant, a routine Tuesday morning flight transformed into a life-threatening emergency. Aaron, sitting in seat 18B, grabbed his armrests as terror seized his chest. This was it. This was how he was going to die. Captain Rebecca Hayes felt the explosion through the entire airframe. 28 years of flying experience kicked in immediately. Engine failure. Right side, she called out, her hands already moving across controls. First Officer David Park was pulling up emergency checklists. Fire warning, right engine, shutting down. Fire extinguisher deployed. Rebecca fought the controls as the plane wanted to roll right with the asymmetric thrust. I have control. Declaring emergency. Get me nearest suitable airport. David was already on the radio. Mayday, mayday, mayday. Flight 293, engine failure and fire, requesting immediate vectors to nearest airport. In the cabin, flight attendant Michelle Torres grabbed the intercom despite her own terror. Her voice came out remarkably steady. Ladies and gentlemen, we have experienced an engine failure. The captain is performing emergency procedures. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened and oxygen masks on. Flight attendants, prepare for emergency landing. Michelle's hands shook as she hung up the intercom, but her training held. She moved through the cabin checking passengers, her eyes scanning for injuries, for panic that might turn into chaos, for any additional problems she needed to manage. Aaron pulled his oxygen mask over his face with trembling hands, his mind racing with thoughts of his family, his wife, his 2 daughters. Would he ever see them again? Around him, other passengers were crying, praying, calling loved ones despite instructions to keep phones away. A woman across the aisle was hyperventilating into her oxygen mask. A teenage boy behind Aaron was recording everything on his phone, tears streaming down his face. A mother held her toddler tight, trying to shield him from the terror. The cabin was chaos, fear, desperate prayers to any god who might be listening. But wait, 3 rows ahead in seat 15C, a 62-year-old man named Thomas Blake sat calmly, his oxygen mask on, his eyes assessing the situation with professional detachment. Thomas was a retired airline captain, 35 years with the same airline operating this flight, thousands of hours in this exact aircraft type. He'd experienced engine failures before, twice in his career, and successfully landed both times. He knew what was happening. He knew what the pilots were doing. And he knew with growing concern that they might need help they didn't know was available. Rebecca fought to keep the plane level. The controls felt mushy, not responding properly. I'm getting asymmetric flight controls. Something else is damaged beyond the engine. David's face was grim as he scanned systems. We've got hydraulic pressure dropping in System A. Shrapnel from the engine must have hit hydraulic lines. We're losing flight control authority. Rebecca's jaw clenched. One engine was bad enough. But compromised flight controls turned this from a serious emergency into a potential catastrophe. How long until we lose control authority completely? David checked his instruments. Hard to say. Minutes maybe. We need to get on the ground now. Air traffic control was clearing all traffic, preparing Reno Tahoe International Airport for emergency landing. Flight 293, you're cleared direct Reno. Runway 21, all emergency services are rolling. Rebecca acknowledged and began a rapid descent. But inside the cockpit, she and David both knew the truth. With degrading flight controls, they might not make it to Reno. The plane was becoming increasingly difficult to control. Every input Rebecca made took more force, gave less response. They were running out of time. Thomas Blake heard the engine tone change as the pilots reduced power to begin descent. He heard the struggle in how the plane was moving, the slight wallowing, the overcompensation in control inputs. He'd felt these exact sensations decades ago when he'd had his second engine failure over Wyoming. He knew what was happening in that cockpit. 2 pilots fighting a crippled airplane, probably young pilots without his decades of experience, trying to solve a problem that was getting worse by the second. Thomas made a decision. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. Michelle saw him stand and rushed over. Sir, you must remain seated. We're in an emergency. Thomas held up a hand, his voice calm and authoritative. I'm Captain Thomas Blake, retired. 35 years flying this exact aircraft. The pilots need to know I'm here. I can help. Michelle hesitated. Protocol said keep passengers seated. But this man's demeanor, his calm in the chaos, his claim of being a pilot, made her pause. Wait here, she said, and rushed to the cockpit, pounding on the door with the emergency pattern. Rebecca answered the intercom. What? Michelle's voice was urgent. Captain, there's a retired pilot in the cabin. 35 years experience in this aircraft type. He says he can help. Rebecca exchanged a glance with David. They had nothing to lose. The plane was barely responding to controls and getting worse. Send him up, Rebecca said. Michelle returned to Thomas. They'll see you. Go. Thomas moved quickly, but calmly toward the cockpit, passengers staring at him in confusion and hope. Was this man really a pilot? Could he save them? Thomas entered the cockpit and immediately took in the situation. Engine fire extinguished, but engine destroyed. Hydraulic system, a failing. Flight controls degrading. Rebecca fighting the yoke. David running emergency checklists. They were behind the airplane, reacting to problems instead of staying ahead. Thomas spoke with calm authority. Captain Blake, retired. I've had 2 engine failures in this aircraft type. What's your hydraulic status? David answered without looking up. System A at 20% and dropping. System B stable at 70%. We're losing control authority. Thomas nodded. I know this failure mode. You need to shift to alternate control law and manually manage hydraulic pressure between systems. I can talk you through it if you want, or I can take the 3rd seat and manage systems while you fly. Rebecca didn't hesitate. Take the 3rd seat. David, brief him on our situation. Thomas slipped into the jump seat, his hands already moving to familiar controls he'd operated for decades. It had been 8 years since he'd retired, but muscle memory was coming back. The cockpit felt like home. System A is gone. Don't try to save it, Thomas said, his voice steady. Route all hydraulic pressure to System B and C. You'll have limited control authority, but enough to land if you stay ahead of the inputs. Start configuring for landing now, even though we're still 20 minutes out. You want gear down early, so you're not trying to extend it at the last minute with degraded systems. Rebecca nodded, already implementing his suggestions. The plane's response improved slightly. Still mushy, still requiring heavy inputs, but better. Controllable. Maybe. You won't believe what Thomas said next. When you shot your engines down, did you secure the fuel to the damaged engine? David checked. Yes, fuel is secured. Thomas shook his head. Not good enough. With shrapnel damage, you've got potential fuel leaks. I want you to dump fuel now. Get us as light as possible. We're going to need every bit of maneuverability for landing, and we don't want to be heavy on touchdown with potentially compromised gear. Rebecca hadn't thought of that. Dump fuel, David. Get us down to minimum safe landing weight. In the cabin, passengers watched fuel streaming from the wings, vaporizing into mist behind the aircraft. Some panicked more, thinking the plane was falling apart. Michelle and the other flight attendants moved through the cabin with forced calm, explaining that fuel dumping was normal procedure, that everything was under control. Aaron watched the fuel dump and felt both terror and strange hope. They were preparing to land. That meant the pilots thought they could land. That meant maybe, possibly, there was hope. Thomas continued coaching Rebecca and David with the calm of someone who'd been exactly here before. Don't fight the plane. Anticipate what it's going to do and stay ahead. She wants to roll right because of the dead engine, so hold constant left aileron pressure. Don't wait for the roll to happen and then correct it. Prevent it. Rebecca adjusted her inputs following his guidance. The plane's flight path steadied. She'd been fighting the aircraft reactively. Thomas was teaching her to control it proactively. The difference was subtle but critical. Reno approach, Flight 293, we've improved our control situation. We have a retired airline captain in the cockpit assisting, requesting long final approach, maximum room for maneuvering. Air traffic control acknowledged immediately. Flight 293, you're cleared for visual approach runway 21 10-mile final. Fire and rescue equipment standing by. Rebecca started the long gradual descent, following Thomas's guidance to make every control input smooth and anticipated rather than reactive and abrupt. Talk to your passengers, Thomas said quietly. They're terrified. You've been silent for 15 minutes while we've been working up here. They need to hear your voice, need to know you're in control. Rebecca nodded and picked up the cabin intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Hayes. We experienced an engine failure and some damage to flight systems. We are currently working with a retired airline captain who is assisting us, and we are making an emergency landing in Reno in approximately 10 minutes. Our flight controls are functioning adequately for landing. Emergency services will be standing by as a precaution. Remain seated, oxygen masks on until I give the all clear. We're going to get you on the ground safely. The words "we're going to get you on the ground safely" were what everyone in the cabin needed to hear. The panic level decreased slightly. People stopped crying quite as hard. The mother holding her toddler loosened her desperate grip slightly. Aaron felt a tiny spark of hope ignite in his chest. They had a plan. They had an extra pilot helping. Maybe, just maybe, they'd make it. He pulled out his phone and texted his wife. Emergency landing. But we have extra pilot helping. I love you. Tell the girls I love them. He hit send and prayed it wouldn't be his last message. The Reno runway came into view. Emergency vehicles lined both sides, lights flashing, foam trucks ready. Thomas continued his steady coaching. Approach speed is going to be higher than normal because of your limited control authority. Don't try to slow down too much, or you'll lose what little control you have. Come in hot, use the whole runway. You've got 10,000 feet. Use all of it if you need to. Rebecca's hands were white-knuckled on the yoke but steady. Gear down, she commanded. David pulled the gear lever. 3 green lights. Gear down and locked. One thing going right. Flaps 15, Rebecca called. David configured flaps. The plane's sink rate increased as drag increased. Thomas watched the instruments. You're high on glide slope, but that's okay. You want to be high. Better to come in steep and controlled than shallow and out of control. Rebecca adjusted, bringing the nose down, increasing descent rate. The runway growing larger in the windscreen. 500 feet, 400, 300. The plane was wobbling, requiring constant tiny corrections, but it was working. They were going to make it. They were actually going to make it. 200 feet. Looking good, David called out. Thomas leaned forward slightly. Don't flare too much. Let her settle onto the runway. You want a firm touchdown, not a greaser. Firm touchdown means you're in control. 100 feet, 50 feet. The runway rushed up at them. Rebecca pulled back slightly on the yoke. The main gear touched the runway with a solid thump, not graceful but controlled. Exactly what Thomas had told her to do. Thrust reversers, Rebecca commanded. David deployed them on the remaining good engine. Brakes, maximum. Rebecca pressed the pedals firmly. The plane shuddered and decelerated, slowing, finally rolling to a stop 3,000 feet from the end of the runway. They'd used more than half the runway, but they were stopped. They were down. They were safe. The cabin erupted in applause, crying, hysterical laughter. People were hugging strangers, kissing loved ones, thanking God and the universe and the pilots. Aaron unbuckled with shaking hands and just sat there, overwhelmed. He was alive. Against all odds, against an engine explosion and flight control damage, and a crippled airplane, he was alive. Around him, passengers were crying and laughing simultaneously, the release of terror into joy almost painful in its intensity. In the cockpit, Rebecca sat back in her seat, her whole body trembling now that the adrenaline was fading. She looked at Thomas Blake, this stranger who'd walked into her cockpit and helped save her airplane. Thank you doesn't seem adequate. Thomas smiled slightly. You did the flying, Captain. You and David kept it together. I just provided perspective from someone who's been there before. You both did excellent work. David wiped his eyes, not ashamed of the tears. We might not have made it without you, sir. That's the truth. Emergency services surrounded the aircraft. Fire crews inspected the damaged engine and wing, spraying foam on hot spots. Paramedics boarded to check passengers for injuries. Miraculously, there were none. Some bumps and bruises from turbulence after the explosion, but nothing serious. The evacuation slides were deployed as a precaution, and passengers slid down into the bright Nevada sunshine, many kissing the ground, calling loved ones, crying with relief. Aaron called his wife. I'm okay. We're all okay. There was an explosion, but we landed. A retired pilot helped save us. I'm coming home. I love you so much. His wife was crying on the other end, barely able to speak through her sobs. But here's what made this rescue even more remarkable. Thomas Blake hadn't just happened to be on that flight by chance. He'd specifically booked the flight because he was attending a reunion of retired pilots in San Francisco the next day. Dozens of pilots with thousands of collective hours of experience all gathering to share stories and reconnect. Thomas had been one of the most experienced, one of the most respected, and he'd been on the exact flight that needed his experience at the exact moment it needed it. The coincidence was almost too perfect to believe. The NTSB investigation revealed the full extent of how close Flight 293 had come to disaster. The engine failure had been catastrophic. A fan blade had fractured, sending metal fragments through the cowling and into the wing structure. Hydraulic lines, fuel lines, and control cables had all been damaged. The pilots had been losing control authority at a rate that would have made the aircraft uncontrollable within minutes. Rebecca and David, excellent pilots but relatively young with less experience in crisis situations, had been doing everything right but were behind the developing emergency. Thomas's arrival had given them the systems management help and experience guidance they needed to stay ahead of the crisis instead of reacting to it. Captain Blake's intervention saved that airplane, the NTSB investigator stated in his preliminary report. The pilots were performing admirably under extreme circumstances, but they were task-saturated and losing situational awareness. Captain Blake's calm, experienced voice in the cockpit allowed them to refocus, prioritize, and implement strategies they might not have thought of in time on their own. His presence turned a likely fatal incident into a successful emergency landing. This is exactly why cockpit resource management principles emphasize using all available resources, including, in rare cases, experienced pilots traveling as passengers. The airline industry took notice. Some airlines began policies of identifying airline pilots active or retired on passenger manifests so that in emergency situations, crew could quickly locate potential assistance. Others enhanced their training to include scenarios where passenger pilots might offer help and how to quickly assess and integrate that help. Thomas Blake's intervention became a case study in cockpit resource management, taught to pilots worldwide as an example of how pride can be set aside in crisis to accept help from any credible source. Rebecca Hayes and David Park both credited Thomas with saving their lives and the lives of everyone aboard Flight 293. At a ceremony 3 months after the incident, they presented Thomas with a plaque to Captain Thomas Blake, whose experience, calm, and willingness to help saved 156 lives on Flight 293. With deepest gratitude, Captain Rebecca Hayes and First Officer David Park, Thomas accepted it with typical humility. "I just did what any pilot would do. We're all in this together. When someone needs help, you help. That's the pilot code." But this is what touched Aaron most when he interviewed everyone involved. Thomas hadn't stood up and announced, "I'm a pilot, let me fly the plane." He'd stood up and said 4 simple words to the flight attendant: "I can help them," not "I'll save everyone," or "I'll fly the plane," or any ego-driven statement. Just "I can help them." The humility and service in those 4 words captured everything Aaron had learned about real heroism. It wasn't about being the star. It was about helping when you could, contributing what you had to offer, being present for others in their crisis. That's what Thomas had done. He'd seen a need and filled it. Nothing more, nothing less. Aaron's article about Flight 293, titled 4 Words at 35,000 Feet, The Retired Pilot Who Saved a Crippled Flight, went viral. Readers were captivated by the drama, the coincidence, the humility. But they were also educated about what actually happens in airline emergencies, how pilots are trained, how cockpit resource management works, how even retired pilots can save lives. The article sparked discussions about expertise, about not wasting talent, about the value of experience that doesn't expire just because someone retires. Thomas Blake received hundreds of letters from passengers on Flight 293, thanking him for standing up, for offering help, for saving their lives. He answered every single one personally. To Aaron's letter thanking him and asking about his thought process, Thomas wrote, "I didn't think about being a hero. I thought about Rebecca and David up in that cockpit, probably young pilots dealing with the worst emergency of their careers. I thought about my own engine failures decades ago and how scared I'd been, how much I'd wished for an experienced voice to guide me. I knew I could be that voice for them, so I stood up. That's all. The rest was just pilots helping pilots solve a problem together." Rebecca Hayes continued flying, but the incident changed her. She was more humble now about the limits of her own knowledge, more willing to seek help, more aware that expertise could come from unexpected places. She spoke at pilot training conferences about the incident, emphasizing the lesson: pride can kill you in the cockpit. "I had a crippled airplane and degrading control authority. I could have told Thomas Blake to sit down, that I had it under control, but I didn't have it under control. I needed help. Accepting that help saved everyone aboard. Never let ego prevent you from using every resource available in a crisis." David Park went on to become a check airman, training other pilots. He always told the story of Flight 293 to his students. "You never know where help will come from," he'd say. "Sometimes it's a retired captain sitting in row 15 who stands up and says, 'I can help them.' Be humble enough to accept that help. And someday, when you're the experienced one and someone else is in crisis, be generous enough to offer that help." That's the pilot community at its best. Experienced hands helping newer hands, everyone working together to keep people safe. 5 years after the incident, the airline held a reunion for the passengers and crew of Flight 293. Over 100 people attended, gathering to remember the day they almost died but didn't. Thomas Blake was the guest of honor, though he tried to deflect attention. "This reunion should honor Rebecca and David," he insisted. "They flew that crippled airplane onto the runway. I just talked while they did the hard work." But Rebecca and David wouldn't let him minimize his role. "We talk. You saved us," Rebecca said simply. "Accept the honor, Captain Blake. You've earned it." Aaron attended the reunion and was struck by the bonds formed between strangers who'd shared a near-death experience. People who'd been sitting next to each other on the flight but hadn't spoken before the engine exploded were now friends, meeting regularly, celebrating birthdays together. The mother with the toddler had stayed in touch with several passengers who'd helped comfort her child during the crisis. The teenage boy who'd recorded everything on his phone had used that footage to create a documentary about the incident that was now shown in aviation safety courses. Crisis had created community. At the reunion dinner, Thomas Blake gave a short speech that Aaron recorded and later included in his book about ordinary people in extraordinary moments. 5 years ago, I was just a retired pilot going to see old friends in San Francisco. I didn't wake up that morning planning to save anyone. But when I heard that engine explode, when I felt the plane struggling, I knew my experience might matter. I knew I might be able to help. So I stood up. That's all any of us can do when we see someone in trouble: stand up and offer what we have. Sometimes what we have is exactly what's needed. Sometimes it's not. But we offer anyway. That's how we get through crisis together. By offering what we have and accepting what others offer. Thank you all for letting me be part of your story. You're all part of mine now too. The applause was thunderous, many in tears. Aaron looked around the room at all these people who'd been given back their lives because one retired pilot had stood up and said 4 words, "I can help them." How many times in life do we have the chance to offer help that might save lives but stay seated because we assume someone else will handle it, or because we doubt our own value? Thomas hadn't doubted. He'd known he could help and he'd offered. That was courage. That was service. That was everything that mattered. 10 years after the incident, Flight 293 remained one of the most studied emergency landings in recent aviation history. The combination of catastrophic engine failure, multiple systems damage, and the intervention of an experienced passenger pilot made it unique. Pilots studied the cockpit voice recorder transcripts, learning from Rebecca and David's communication, from Thomas's calm guidance, from how they'd worked together as an ad hoc crew. This is textbook cockpit resource management, instructors would say. Using every resource available regardless of where it comes from. That's how you survive the unsurvivable. Thomas Blake lived to see his 82nd birthday, still sharp, still engaged with aviation, still mentoring young pilots. When he passed away peacefully at 83, his funeral was attended by hundreds, fellow retired pilots Rebecca Hayes and David Park, dozens of passengers from Flight 293, airline executives, NTSB investigators. Everyone whose lives he'd touched wanted to pay respects. At the service, Rebecca gave the eulogy, her voice breaking as she spoke. Captain Thomas Blake didn't have to stand up that day. He could have stayed in his seat, assumed the pilots in the cockpit had everything under control, let someone else handle the crisis. But that wasn't who he was. When he saw need, he met it. When he had something to offer, he offered it. Those 4 words, "I can help them," saved 156 lives, including mine. But more than that, they taught me how to live. Always be ready to help. Always offer what you have. Never assume your experience doesn't matter. Captain Blake, thank you for standing up. Thank you for helping us. Thank you for showing us what service looks like. We'll miss you, but we'll honor you by living the lesson you taught. When we see someone who needs help, we'll stand up and say, "I can help them," just like you did. Aaron's final article about Thomas Blake, published after his death, reflected on legacy and impact. Thomas Blake was a retired airline captain who lived quietly, didn't seek attention, didn't need recognition. But on one Tuesday morning in his 62nd year, he stood up in a crippled airplane and offered 4 words that changed 156 lives forever. "I can help them." Those words led to a successful emergency landing. They led to 0 fatalities in an incident that should have killed everyone. They led to changes in aviation policy. They led to a case study taught worldwide. They led to a reunion community that still meets annually. They led to lessons about humility, service, and expertise that continue rippling forward 15 years later. Thomas Blake stood up. That's his legacy. That's what we should all aspire to, standing up when we see need, offering what we have, helping when we can. 4 words, "I can help them." Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything. Flight 293's accident aircraft was eventually repaired and returned to service, flying for another 8 years before being retired. The airline kept the cockpit voice recorder transcript framed in their crew training center, with a simple plaque, "Captain Thomas Blake, Passenger Seat 15C, Flight 293, I can help them." Remember, expertise can come from anywhere. Pride has no place in the cockpit. Use every resource available. Accept help graciously. Offer help generously. That's how everyone survives. Rebecca Hayes eventually made captain on wide-body international aircraft, reaching the pinnacle of her career. She credited Thomas Blake with not just saving her life, but teaching her the leadership lesson that defined her career. Great leaders accept help without ego. They recognize that in crisis, expertise matters more than rank. Thomas didn't need to be in command to help us. He just needed to share what he knew. That's leadership, using your knowledge to support others, regardless of your official role. I've tried to lead that way ever since. David Park, now a captain himself, kept a photo of Thomas Blake on his flight bag. When curious crew members asked about it, David would tell the story of Flight 293 and the retired captain who'd saved them. "He's my reminder," David would say. "Reminder that I might be the Thomas Blake in someone's story someday. Reminder to stay humble enough to accept help. Reminder to offer help when I see need. Reminder that 4 words, 'I can help them,' might be the most important words I ever say." Aaron included Thomas Blake's story in his book's final chapter, titled 4 Words. The chapter explored the power of simple offers of help, of expertise shared generously, of courage measured not in dramatic gestures but in standing up when needed. Thomas Blake didn't save Flight 293 with superhuman flying skills, Aaron wrote. He saved it with experience, calm guidance, and the willingness to help when helping mattered. He stood up in a moment of crisis and said 4 words. 4 words that changed everything for 156 people. That's the power we all have to stand up, to offer what we know, to help when help is needed. We don't need to be heroes, we just need to be human beings willing to say I can help them and then follow through. Thomas Blake showed us how. Now it's our turn. The legacy of Flight 293 lived on in countless ways. Every pilot trained after the incident learned about Thomas Blake's intervention. Every crew member heard about the importance of accepting help from any credible source. Every passenger who learned the story was reminded that heroes look like retired 62-year-old men in jeans and a polo shirt who stand up and offer 4 simple words. The story became part of aviation culture, a reminder that expertise matters, experience matters, and the willingness to help matters most of all. 15 years after that terrifying Tuesday morning, Aaron stood at Thomas Blake's grave, placing a small model airplane on the headstone. The inscription read, Captain Thomas Blake, 1951-2026. He stood up when others needed him. He offered what he had. He saved lives with 4 words, I can help them. Blue skies and tailwinds, Captain. Thank you for showing us how to serve. Aaron thought about all the stories he'd documented over the years, people doing extraordinary things in ordinary moments. But Thomas Blake's story remained one of his favorites because it was so pure, so simple, so replicable. Anyone with expertise in any field could do what Thomas did. See a need in their area of knowledge, stand up, offer help, follow through. 4 words could change everything. 4 words had changed everything on Flight 293. I can help them. That was the lesson. That was the legacy. That was how ordinary people became heroes, by offering what they had when it was needed most. Somewhere right now, a plane is in trouble. Somewhere someone with expertise is sitting in a passenger seat, unaware that their knowledge will soon be desperately needed. When that moment comes, will they stay seated, or will they stand up and offer 4 words that might save lives? Thomas Blake showed the way. He stood up. He said, I can help them. And 156 people lived because of it. That's not luck. That's not coincidence. That's human beings at their best, sharing expertise, offering help, standing up when sitting down would be easier. That's justice in its purest form. The right person in the right place at the right time with the right knowledge and the willingness to share it. That's Thomas Blake's gift to everyone who hears his story. The reminder that we all have something to offer, and sometimes offering it is the most important thing we'll ever do.